Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Guest List podcast. I'm your host, Steve Guest. Really looking forward to speaking with today's guest, and it's someone that I've grown to really like. I spend time with them. We have our conversations. We've even grabbed the odd game of golf. So I'm going to jump straight into their bio. Today's guest has been involved with audio in one way or another for more than half of his life. As a presenter and producer for 30 years, he worked on producing award-winning radio shows on a local, regional, and national level before. In 2017, deciding to strike out on his own into the world of podcasting. Since then, he's helped hundreds of people get their start into the podcast arena, with hundreds of thousands of people listening into the podcasts created by his company, MonkeyPants Productions. Pete has a deep love for audio in all of its forms and is always striving for better quality content, whilst also making sure that podcasting is accessible to as many people as possible. Mr. Pete Morgan.
Hello, how are you?
Do you know what? In all the guests, in all the podcast bios I've done in nearly, 18 months?
Yeah.
That's the first bio where I've slipped up and said the name. Of all the bios to slip up, you'd be the person that basically is the epicenter of the podcast itself.
Yeah, so for those that don't, I listen to this podcast, I listen to every episode because I edit it and I produce it. So I listen to, and as I was saying, as Steve was doing his intro, I was thinking, don't mouth along with the intro, because I've heard every single one numerous times, because I don't just listen once. Sometimes I'll listen twice, I'll listen again, listen 3 or 4 times. So, well, there we go. That's lovely.
You get to listen to my brummy dulcet tone.
Not at all. It's nowhere near as strong as you think. That's the thing with people's accents. People think, I've got this really strong brummy, and it's like, you really haven't. I'm not saying you haven't got an accent. Of course you have. But because there's a part of me that thinks I sound like Liam Gallagher, that I'm proper, because I'm from Manchester originally.
Yeah.
And one of my first jobs on professional radio was reading traffic and travel reports. And I worked for the AA because that was one of the things that they used to provide. Yeah. And I was doing traffic and travel reports. I was living in Manchester. The office was based in Manchester, and we were doing traffic and travel reports for the station that is now called BBC Radio Manchester. It was called GWR at the time. And the boss there, a guy called Martin Hemfield, got in touch with my boss and said, we don't want Pete doing our bulletins anymore because he's too Mancunian. And I'm like, how Mancunian do you have to be that you're too Mancunian for the Manchester station for the BBC? So I really worked on my accent. So it's a lot softer. But there's always that part of me. I know if I go back, so I'm going back up to Manchester in the next couple of weeks, see the family. And I know 15 minutes after I'm back at home, it drops and it's right back there. Yeah. And, oh, yeah, it's great. Yeah, no, I was speaking to Steve on his podcast. And that sounds like I'm putting on a voice. But genuinely, that's what I'm like about half an hour after I'm back at the kind of the home with my mum and dad.
See, I love all of that. I describe myself as a posh Brummy. I'm not like Brummy.
No.
I think having a few years away when I lived overseas, 3 years in Oxford taught me that kind of southern twang a little bit, although I was classed as the northerner at Oxford Books.
Of course you were.
There's no such thing as a Midlander, is there?
No, not at all.
Well, look, welcome onto the podcast. I thought it was about time.
That's very kind.
You have worked tirelessly in the background, making sure these podcasts go out every week. That's no easy feat because I'm not always on time. I don't always get things through. Allowing you enough time to do the job that you do, but it's always done. It's always there.
Yeah.
We were talking just before we started, so you had a bit of a late night.
Yeah, so the company's really expanded in the past couple of years, and I've been started to work with a company on the west coast of America. A company with just as unique a name as MonkeyPants Productions. It's a company called Sounds Fishy Productions. And one of the things that they do is they produce webinars for people, because California still has quite a rigid and robust COVID procedures in place. So there's still kind of masks in a lot of places and social distancing. And so a lot of things that used to happen face to face now happen remotely. They happen on Zoom generally. And one of the things that Sounds Fishy do is they, as I say, produce these webinars, and predominantly it's educational training. So it's teaching teachers how to educate kids who are dual language, who are either Chinese speakers who are learning English, or obviously predominantly in California, it's Spanish speakers learning English. But last night was a slightly different one in the fact that it was a school superintendent election kind of meeting. So it was the two candidates answering questions. And it was one of those where it was like, right, you have 2 minutes to give your answer. So what I was doing was I was putting graphics up on screen. So that it all kind of looked good. But more importantly, I was timing the candidates. And if they went over the time, I had music to play in, like the Oscars, to kind of play them off.
To push them along a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, just kind of encourage them.
Countdown clock.
That's the end of your answer.
Yeah.
But obviously being California, they're 8 hours behind. Okay. So it was an early evening event. So it started at 6 o'clock in the evening, their time. 5 o'clock in the evening. So that was 1 o'clock in the morning here, and finished at about 2:45 UK time, which there was like 7:45 in the evening. So they were just like, yeah, well, that was a nice evening. Now I'm sat here in you know, kind of my place. Can I go to bed now? Can I?
And then you get up and speak to me.
Exactly. And
what more could you want?
Because so one of the things I'm doing now is I'm a big supporter of the drive for the 4-day week. I think that's a really good thing for the workplace. I know it doesn't work for everyone, doesn't work for every industry, it doesn't work for every company, but for me and Monkey Pants, I think it's something we do. So I try and work towards a 4-day week. Don't always achieve it, but I really try and keep my Fridays empty. And today, this is it. I'm speaking to you, and then I'm done for the weekend. That's it, baby.
Amazing. So look, I mean, talk to me about podcasts. So we got talking, actually not about podcasting.
No.
We initially met. It was about getting Top Biller, Life of a Recruiter out on audio, and you kindly managed that for me. I don't know whether you remember the actual scenario and how it actually then panned out.
I remember meeting you and having a cup of tea, and we talked about it, and then the kind of my memory jumps to the recording of it, because the recording was quite a steep learning curve for me as recording, because it's, you know, 30 years in radio, your speech is always in short bursts. The most you'd ever do, you might do 10 minutes. I did kind of talk stuff. I worked on BBC Local, I worked on 5 Live a little bit, and of course there is no music, it's all talk. But even then, the talk is in bursts. You've got a guest, or you've got a newsreader, or you've got a traffic and travel reporter, or whatever. But recording an audio book, it's just you, it's just your voice. So with any other kind of voiceover stuff that I do, I just do it, lay it down, do it in one chunk. But with this, I had to kind of really schedule it properly and go, right, you can only do an hour. And I had to do it kind of first thing in the morning, because that's when your voice is at its strongest.
Yeah.
So I would literally get up, sit at my desk, and just record for about an hour, 90 minutes. And as soon as I could hear just like a tiredness in my voice, then I would stop. And I've spoken to kind of people that have done. Actually, I'm going to drop a name. I might drop a couple of names during this. But I was speaking to, yeah. I mean, it's not a massive name, but I was speaking to Danny Baker about this. And when he's recording his books, obviously he just does it. And what they do is they just take kind of 15, 20 minute, half an hour breaks, and he'll drink some water, only because sometimes the break in the day might be mid-chapter.
Yeah.
So you've got to make sure that your voice sounds the same for the second half of the chapter as it did for the first.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of keep your voice at a good kind of working level. And that was the big thing for me, of just keeping it there, really.
I can understand that. So the initial story was, I came to you and I said, I'd like to record Top Biller as an audiobook, and I was going to do it. And I asked you for advice. How would I do that? And we talked about sitting in a quiet room in the house with a duvet over my head, looking at 45-minute sections and seeing what I can do. And it was about the time when COVID hit and the pandemic hit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it got to the point where I had committed in my own head that the audiobook was going to be done by April or May, I think it was, of that year. And I think I ended up saying, Pete, I can't do this. Can you take the reins? Would you do it for me? Which you gladly did.
Yeah.
Obviously, the success of Top Biller and surprising success, I might add, how well it's actually done, led me to write the second book. Yeah. And now we're in a position where we've had exactly the same conversation. I've attempted to record the audio a few times, and it is difficult. It is really genuinely difficult. I can read into a mic. I'm used to speaking like this, but when you really understand the little kind of things you do, the whatever it is, the kind of little accents you might put in, or the pauses, or actually, I find myself when I'm reading, I add little words in that aren't there, or I might take words out, and trying to do that and get through a whole book. I'm not sure I've managed a chapter yet in what I've sent you. Trying.
No, and so the difficulty is when people add stuff in, and the tiny occasional words are it's not quite as big an issue, but as soon as you kind of change what the content is, then it's they have to list it differently. Apparently they can't, it has to be kind of classed as abridged rather than unabridged, because what you're listening to, if you bought the book, and you would be getting something different than if you listen to the audiobook.
Okay.
And that's when it becomes, and I mean, the thing that I have developed, so I joined the BBC in 2007, and that, doing the breakfast shows, which is what I predominantly did in my time, that's all scripts.
Okay.
You're constantly working off scripts. And what I had to get good at was reading from a script that you've seen about 10 seconds previously and making it sound like it's your words.
Yeah.
So I could kind of play around with it. I can move the language a little bit, but you couldn't change the salient facts. Okay. So, if it was, we've just found out that, the mayor has decided to give everybody a balloon. Okay. He's going to be doing it in the town centre today at 2:00. Why he's doing that, I'm not quite sure, but let's just say. So that's the detail. It's the mayor, it's the town centre, it's 2:00. Everyone's getting a balloon.
Okay.
Everything around that, I can use my own syntax, my own vocabulary. Okay. I'm a big ummer and error. Yeah. do lots of. I've just done one there, ums and ers, because that's just the way my speech goes. But when I'm broadcasting, in inverted commas, when I'm kind of delivering something, it tends to go away. And it's not as prevalent, but that's just a skill that I've developed. So I do it. So I do a monthly podcast for Birmingham Children's Hospital. I turn their newsletter, their fundraising newsletter, into a monthly podcast. So they send their script through, and it's because of the way their fundraising team works and because of the way Birmingham Children's Hospital is, it's a really quick turnaround, and they're sending the script through and they need it within a couple of hours. And also, and this might make me sound really heartless, and it isn't meant to be, I don't do it for any money. So I have put it into such a place that it doesn't actually take up that much of my time. So I don't mind doing it for no money. So literally I get the script on email and I start my system recording, and then I pull up the script and I just read it. And unless there's a medical term in there that I'm like, I've never heard that before, then there's very rarely spots where I'll stumble or but that's a skill that I've picked up. The difficult thing from your point of view surely is you're reading out something that you've written, and you would have written it kind of to be internally read. You've written it for someone to sit there and go, oh, sage advice there, Steve, thanks very much. So that's the difficulty from that some people find, when they start doing the audiobook versions of their book.
It is difficult because you're reading your thoughts out loud, or your stories, or things that have happened to you. And we all know, as you kind of move through, you might add little bits, you might take bits out as you talk about them. And naturally, as you're reading your own story, you want to go off. Well, I do anyway, because I tend to waffle quite a bit. You'll go off on different tangents at different parts. I'm thinking, oh, that's a great bit to put in there. But it's actually 4 sentences later. But because I think it fits while I'm reading it, I want to say it then.
Yeah. Because the conversation that we have with each other, like the conversation we're having now, or if you and I meet for a coffee, the conversation is different. It isn't as structured as when it's all written down. You will have gone through revisions and drafts, and you don't get to do that with conversations. It is just, I say this, you say that. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot to tell you about, when I got a free balloon off the mayor the other day. It's that,
Yeah, so true. So talk to me about podcasting. So my podcast went live end of March last year.
Wow.
So it's been going a fair while now.
Yeah.
I kind of fell into podcasting, if I'm honest. I know we had conversations over a couple of breakfasts, I think, and I was at a point where I was getting lots of messages and lots of contact and didn't know really how to either answer that or continue to share value. And I thought at the time podcasting would be good to do. From a selfish perspective, I get to talk to some great people. And actually, it's something that I can put out there on a weekly basis that hopefully gives value to the listeners. That's my motive. You deal with a lot of podcasters. You've got your own podcast. Talk to me about perhaps some of the audience out there, or the people that you deal with.
I mean, the whole industry has really kind of changed and is constantly changing. So the world leaders in podcasting, as far as the West are concerned, is America. The investment is huge, and the development is vast. Apple Podcasts now. So just before the pandemic, so tail end of 2019, Apple Podcasts were publishing about 350 new podcasts a day. Okay. In April of 2020, so as far as the UK was concerned, that was a month after the first lockdown happened.
Yeah.
So we were all in our homes. So in April of 2020, that number went up to 3,500 new podcasts every day being released by Apple Podcasts. That's a global figure.
Yeah.
Now, 75% of those don't last more than a month.
Okay.
Because they're done by a production house, or the example I generally give is the BBC, where they've created these 6, 7, 8, 10 episodes, whatever, and that's all they're putting out. So they put it out and that's it, and they don't put any more out. Or people started a podcast, and I know people that did this. You start a podcast and then you kind of realize, oh no, I haven't got the commitment for it. I can't.
Hard work, isn't it?
It is to get it out. I'm really impressed, Steve, by doing it every week. I think you've got a really good, and it's genuinely, it's a format I kind of, talk to other clients about, of having that interview one week and that solo podcast the next week, because one, that kind of takes the pressure off you a little bit regarding sourcing guests and putting it together and kind of constructing it and researching that guest, and it helps us as a listener develop a stronger bond, I think, with you. There's a real parallel between podcasting and radio, which is kind of why I can transfer a lot of the skills that I've learned over 30 years. It's all about the relationship with the listener. You are looking to create a bond with a person, and at the same time, you're looking to create a tribe of loyal listeners. And the difficulty is with that, and similarly, you were doing it in radio, but you should only ever talk as though you're talking to one person, mainly because for a long time, listening to the radio was a single pursuit. It wasn't something you did it when you were in the car, or you did it when you were kind of when you were in the shower in the morning and you put the radio on. Maybe there was a family, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people around, but it wasn't like a big group. But you were still after that kind of tribe, because you wanted to speak to people later on and go, did you hear that on the radio this morning? Yeah. Podcasting is exactly the same. You're always ever talking to one person. Podcasting is I describe it as, it's an intimate thing. When I listen to podcasts, so I'm subscribed to about, I think 78 was what I tagged.
That's a lot of podcasts.
It really is. And I will confess, I don't listen to 78 in a week. Yeah. But kind of when we go on holiday and stuff like that, it's a good chance to go, all right, okay, let's get back on those. But I listen when I'm walking my dog. I listen when I'm going to sleep at night. I listen when I'm on my own in the day. It's really intimate. It's me and it's the host, and that's it. Yeah. And that really kind of creates that bond, the bond that you're talking about. So when I was growing up, the breakfast show I used to listen to, or the morning show, if you're in America, was Chris Evans on Radio 1. He was my breakfast
Love
show.
Chris Evans. I listened to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the thing is, if you saw him in the street, you would greet him like he was a friend, because he is a friend. He's your friend on the radio who you have listened to for 30 years. Yeah. He doesn't know you. He has no idea who you are. I'm sure he would after a short while, but but that's the relationship. That's the bond that you have with your listener, is you are their familiar. You are their touchstone of, I know. So when people, let's take the guest list as an example. The touchstone of this podcast is you. You are the root of this podcast. Now, there's going to be people who will listen to this podcast because, so for instance, my mum will listen to this episode because it's me that's on it. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's going to be people who listen to every single episode, and they do that not because they think, well, Pete Morgan might be on at some point, but they listen because of you. They like you, they like your style, they like how you are, they like your ethos, they like the other things that go with you, on on the social media that you do and the content that you put out there, and they like the books. So this is just a part of it, and that's how they make that connection with you. And that comes back to what I was saying about the strength of your solo episodes. Is that's a good chance, because the people we admire and the people we respect and the people we are entertained by and like, we want to get to know them better, and we love moments and glimpses when when we feel we do know them better. And that's what the solo episodes, I think, do for you and your listeners. They create that bond, they strengthen that bond of, right, I know Steve better now. And it's all subconscious. Nobody's doing this consciously, but it's when it happens and when it clicks, it's such a strong loyalty that you have. You just mentioned now you're still listening to Chris Evans, because you've got that bond with him, and he's the person that you want to hear from. He's the person that you want to tell you that the world is okay, and here's something that's entertaining. Which is really all a breakfast show is. And with a podcast, all that your loyal tribe want to hear from you is that they're okay. What they should be doing. Here's something of value. You're giving them something, but you're also giving of yourself as well. And they really, they like that and latch onto it, and it just kind of strengthens that bond all the time.
I'm always surprised, genuinely humbled and surprised. So I was talking to a client this week, I think, and we're looking to book a meeting for a catch-up coffee in a couple of weeks. And he works for a large PLC main construction contractor, talking about recruitment and everything else, doing the normal day job. And he said, I must say, Steve, I listen to your podcast every week and it's brilliant. I love the way that you approach your guests and who you have on there. It's really diverse. It's really engaging. Fantastic feedback. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, why are you listening to my podcast? How do you even know about it?
But that's, and again, this is what I say, because too many people. So primarily, apart from a couple of examples, a couple of podcasts, the majority of my clients are business owners. They're coaches, they're influencers, and they want to pass on their expertise and cement themselves as an expert in what they do. But too often, what they do when it comes to marketing their podcast is they just tell their network about it. And it's like, listen, your network is already part of your network. They'll listen to a couple of episodes maybe, but it becomes a good podcast when you start to take it outside, and it's people that you don't know, you have never spoken to them before. You might not be connected to them on LinkedIn. So the first podcast I did was back in 2017. It was about dogs. And I did, so we've got 2 dogs. So I started a podcast when we got the second dog. So it was all about getting a new dog, but also getting a second dog and how that was. Did a bit of market research. There was about 7 podcasts out there, dog related at the time, but they were all professional dog trainers. Nobody was doing what I call it was a journal podcast. So it was effectively an audio diary that we were doing, and I'd record it every Friday morning. So I did that for a couple of years, every week. And as the dog's behavior kind of plateaued off, I kind of went down to every 2 weeks. And then towards the end, I think I went every 3 weeks. And I finished it in July of 2019. It was about 83 episodes, I think I did in total. And initially it was friends and family that were listening. But then I started getting messages and Facebook comments from people in America. And even now, so the podcast is still out there. It's called the Puppy Podcast. And, the advice is universal. It's general. It's not changed. But predominantly the audience is American.
Okay.
Well, I know about 7 people in America, and none of them listen to the podcast. So it is that thing of it just kind of grew, and it's all about the social media marketing of just telling people it's here. This podcast is here. This is this podcast. It's a podcast about dogs. It's a puppy podcast. Do you want to know about dogs? Here's a podcast. And the fine line when you're first marketing your podcast is between telling people that you're there and nagging them to death that your podcast is there.
Yeah.
And I somehow did it, and it's still getting downloads even now. It's still doing pretty well in the charts for something that I've not updated. And every now and again I think, I might do a new episode, and it's like, well, no, it exists perfectly well, and it's little 83 episodes, but it went outside of my network, and that's what kind of took it to the next level of, I don't know any of these people that are listening to this now. It is.
Talk to me about. So you've obviously got a lot of podcasts. What are your top 5 podcasts that they're kind of your go-to when you want to have a listen?
Okay.
Obviously, you don't need to name the guest list.
and that's the thing. So I'm subscribed to all of my clients' podcasts, and I listen occasionally. So obviously I listen when I'm making it.
Yeah, you hear
when
the episodes
I'm editing
anyway.
it, I hear it.
Yeah.
But it's a really strange thing, and I remember trying to explain this to someone. So when I'm editing it, I'm listening to it, but I'm not hearing it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, because what I'm listening to is how the speech is going. Are there stumbles? Are there breaks in the conversation? So sometimes I will listen to it twice. So I listen to it and then I hear it, if that makes sense. Yeah. So my top 5 it changes on a regular basis. So at the moment,
Have I put you on the spot?
A little bit, but it's fine. There's always ones I can go with. I'm one of the billions of people who love a good true crime podcast.
Okay.
I cannot get enough of them if they're done incredibly well. And the Serial podcast, which was an American one, and that kind of really started the trend of true crime podcasts. It started with the case of Adnan Saeed, a young lad who'd been convicted of killing his girlfriend, and Serial casted doubt on this, and it was one of those big debates of, you'd meet people who go, have you listened to Serial? Yeah. What do you think? Do you think he did it or he didn't? Oh, I think he did it. No, he can't have done it. What about the cell phone? Anyway, and there's been documentaries about it. They've recently done an updated episode because he's been freed from prison, and he's going to be retried because 2 new strong suspects have been, because of new evidence that was thrown up and investigated by the podcast. It's absolutely incredible. So Serial is one of the, and then they've done other series as well, which was really, really good. And there's a really good BBC one called The Missing Crypto Queen, which is about this woman who created a cryptocurrency called OneCoin, which was effectively a pyramid scheme. It wasn't a cryptocurrency. And she gave a talk, got on a plane, and was never seen again. And they've been investigating. And again, they've just done 2 new episodes. They've not done any episodes for about a year, 18 months, because they're trying to track this woman down. They're trying to find her. Because it's believed that she's still alive. But it's where she is, because she's got a lot of people's money. And I think they've done an updated episode because the FBI have just put her on the most wanted list. So yeah, the Missing Crypto Queen, I think, is one of my favorites. I love good interview podcasts. But I love them where there's kind of occasionally like a note of irreverence. I'm a big fan of a British comedian and writer and presenter called Adam Buxton, who, if you watch TV kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, had a program on Channel 4 called Adam and Joe, the Adam and Joe Show. And so Adam Buxton interviews everyone. It's a real kind of wide range of people. So generally from the entertainment arena. And he's just done an episode with Graham Norton, which launched his latest series. And Graham, we're used to Eurovision Graham or the Graham Norton show Graham. And he's not that at all in this episode. He's Graham Norton. He was a writer and, a son and an Irishman. Yeah. And it's I changed my opinion of Graham Norton after listening to that episode. So the Adam Buxton podcast is another one. My favorite TV show of all time is The West Wing. It finished 15 years ago now, but I still love it. I think the writing is brilliant. If you've never seen it, it's a drama set in the West Wing of the White House. It was started in the Clinton era and went through to the George W. Bush era, and stars Martin Sheen as Jed Bartlett, the president, and it's about him and his staff and how they face what they do. It ran for 7 seasons. And it's just superb. So there was a podcast that came out called The West Wing Weekly, where a super fan and a former cast member would do a weekly podcast where they would talk about an episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
And after doing a couple of seasons, they decided to do some live shows. And so I think I saw them on every tour.
Okay.
I saw them twice in London, once at Union Chapel, once at the Hammersmith Apollo, which they sold out. So I remember doing a post about it at the time of, this isn't a musical act that sold this out. This is a podcast that has sold this out.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. So I saw them twice in London, once in Washington, and then I flew out to Los Angeles for them to record their last ever episode of the show. And I met Martin Sheen, and met, a lot of the cast. So the West Wing Weekly is a show that's very dear to my heart, and the West Wing Weekly is probably one of my favorites. Another one is 99% Invisible, which is a show about design hosted by a guy called Roman Mars, who has got one of the best voices in the world. And each episode is like a mini documentary, and they just look at the 99% Invisible talks about the stuff that we just don't see, but we all interact with. Mm-hmm. So there was a really good episode about the bleep that radio stations or TV programs use for swearing.
Yeah.
And how it came about and how it's kind of changed over time, and now people tend not to use it. And indeed, it talked about podcasting of some do, some don't. Does it draw attention to it? And that was, so 99% Invisible, I can't recommend it enough. Go and listen to it. Pick an episode and just look at the title of the episode and think, yeah, that sounds like something I'd be interested in. And it's just learning. I'm a big fan of just gaining new knowledge all the time. And then the final one, funnily enough, has Roman Mars again. One of my big kind of passions is American history, American politics.
Yeah.
And when Trump was in office, Roman Mars' neighbor is a constitutional law professor. So they did a podcast called What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law. And they would look at one of his tweets, see how it tied into an amendment to the Constitution, and talk about how that amendment came about and how he's challenging what it is now. and they carry it on now, and it's now called What Roman Mars Can Learn About Con Law.
Okay.
But again, it's everything for me. It's American politics, but it's American history, and American political history is absolutely fascinating from my point of view. But there's so many more in there. I mean, Dirty John is a great podcast. Richard Herring's Leicester Square Theatre podcast, the Queen pod, because I'm a big Queen fan, so there's a load of Queen fans getting together. Prince's, I'm a big Prince fan, so Paisley Park did a load of podcasts when he kind of released a load of his back catalogue, or his estate released a load of his back. I mean, God, Steve, there's so
Endless,
many,
isn't it?
there's so many out there, but I love it. I love kind of going, and with some of them, I listen to one episode and think, okay, that's enough for me. And some I really kind of grip onto, and I'm like, okay, and I listen to every episode, without fail. I love good audio documentaries. There's a great ghost one called Uncanny, which started off, in fact, it starts with one called the Battersea Poltergeist, which is a true story that happened in Battersea, a borough of London, in the 60s, 70s. It was done as a TV drama as well, but they do it as kind of documentary and dramatic recreations as a podcast, and that led on to this one called Uncanny, where listeners get in touch and go, "You think that was scary? Wait till I tell you what happened to me." And it's a little bit hokey in parts, but it's just well told and treated very fairly. It's not a ghost story like as in this definitely happened, or have you heard what this idiot's saying? What the host does, he gets in someone who believes in ghosts and someone who's very skeptical about ghosts, and they talk about, okay, well, if it isn't a ghost, what is it? And the other one, the ghost hunter or the believer will be like, well, no, it's clearly, the energy of a past soul wanting to contact. And the other person's going, wait a minute, they live by a railway line. It's clearly the train's going past every 20 minutes. And so I really like that it's really measured. So I'm genuine. The thing I always say to people who say, and I still meet people who go, I don't really understand podcasts, or I don't really listen to podcasts. Just think of something that you like, whether it's a hobby, whether it's a musician, an actor, an influencer, a business leader, a thought leader, and type their name or it into the search bar of a podcast app. And either they're doing a podcast, or there is a podcast about that thing, an episode about that thing. So there's a podcast for everyone and everything.
What an answer.
Sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's great. Okay. So, I mean, people listening to this, I have conversations reasonably consistently of, oh, I'm going to do a podcast, or I've thought about doing a podcast, or how do you get started? What do you do? I get messages on occasion saying, well, what's the basic setup? Where do you start? How did you get started? For anybody listening to this that is thinking of getting into a podcast, starting a podcast, where do you begin? What do you do?
The first thing you absolutely should do is, I always tell people, know what you're going to do. So have a plan, but don't plan too much. There's a friend of mine who wanted to start a podcast where he was going to be speaking to incredible people. And, I hear a lot of people saying, this is the podcast that I want to do. That's such a broad kind of remit for your podcast. Okay, what makes a person incredible? Surely everyone's in there at some point in their lives.
Yeah.
So he planned it for 2 years and did 4 episodes and then stopped.
2 years of planning.
Exactly. And that's what I mean of you are not going to hit the ground running with podcasting. It just isn't, or it's very, very unlikely. So plan. Know what your podcast is going to be about. Know who your podcast is going to be for. Buy a microphone. you know, the number of people who say, "Oh yeah, no, I do a podcast. Do it on my phone." And there's a great app called Anchor FM. Do your podcast on your phone. And listen, if your podcast is these are my favorite video games, or this is my favorite movie, and I want to tell you about it, that's fine. That is perfectly legitimate and power to you. But if you are a business owner, a business manager, or a business leader, and you are wanting to either sell the image of your business and cement that, or cement yourself as an industry expert, why on earth would you do it with bad quality audio? It's like, you know, making your business website but doing it in crayon. Why would you do that to somebody? You know, bad audio, again, on a subconscious level, it can really affect how people view you.
Yeah,
So why would you do that? So you get a good microphone, and when I say a good microphone, you want a good USB microphone. You want something. You don't need to be spending really more than £200, but probably no more than £150. For about £100, £120, you can get a good USB microphone.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you record, you pick somewhere quiet. You pick somewhere quiet, and you pick somewhere that don't record in your bathroom, and don't record in like the biggest, noisiest room in your house. You know, pick somewhere relatively quiet, or your office. Pick somewhere relatively quiet, and do a pilot. Do 2 pilots. Do 3 pilots until you feel relatively confident in putting together these episodes, this content. Don't launch. You know, I mean, the first episode of the Puppy Podcast is atrocious, because I went into it in that really arrogant way of, I've been speaking into a microphone for 30 years. I know how to do this. So I literally just put the microphone up, started speaking, and it's 12 minutes of this goon just stumbling through his own thoughts. There's nothing. And so that was my first lesson, was to kind of go back and go, right, I need an episode plan. I need to know, because it was mainly just me. It was just my voice. So when you do your solo ones, you don't just kind of put a big word on a piece of paper and go, that'll do. You will make, and I know this because I know you will make notes. You will have a direction that you want to go. So you will know, this is where I'm starting, this is where I'm ending. And whenever you're doing, you know, particularly a business related podcast, you've got to think, what is the listener going to get out of this? Because we listen to podcasts for one reason and one reason only, and that is because they make our lives better in some way. Either because we're entertained, or because we're informed. We get something of value. We get information that will make our lives better. And you've got to honestly look at your content. And if it's not doing one of those things, then people aren't going to listen to it. And you've got to think about, when you think about people listening to it, don't think, you know, is my network going to listen to it? Are my friends going to listen to it? Don't think of that. You've got to think in 6 months, a year, 2 years. So with the guest list, there will be people who will still be discovering the first episode you did. Yeah. They'll still be discovering kind of one of the early solo episodes that you did. And that's the other thing I love about podcasting, is it continues to exist for as long as you're hosting the audio out there. So it's planning, getting a good microphone, doing a pilot. You know, don't kind of, you know, work for ages to get this amazing guest, and then when you're on a Zoom call in front of them, think, okay, I've never interviewed anyone in my life. I've not written an intro. I don't know how to do this. You know, do a pilot, kind of run it through a couple of times, and get someone who's critical, but constructive, to listen back to it and go, okay, you need to change this.
Get someone really good that's good at editing as well.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that goes without saying, but you know.
I mean, who would you go to?
Who could we?
Yeah.
Let's but it's one of those things, and that's what I like about kind of good business owners. They realize, like with all outsourcing, these things you could probably do it, Steve. You could probably learn how to edit audio, but why? Why? Kind of, because I'm willing to do it. I love doing it, and I can do it better than you can do it. I've been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah.
So just let me do it.
Yeah. I'm happy with that.
Exactly.
You can continue to do it. Well, look, I mean, I always end the podcasts with a question.
Yeah.
I hope you've got something ready. If there was one piece of advice you'd leave the listeners with, what would that be?
It would probably be remain curious. One of the sad things I've seen, so I've just turned 50.
Mm-hmm. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that I've seen, I adore my mum and dad, and I'm very lucky that they're still with us. They're in their early 70s, so they had me when they were quite young. Mm-hmm. But as they've gotten older, their kind of world view has gotten narrower. And I'm not saying the kind of, when we talk about our grandparents going to, they're incredibly bigoted and they're not like that, but they've no desire to go out. They don't watch. My mum watches, the Yorkshire Vet, Emmerdale Farm, and kind of the Darling Buds of May, and that's it. There's never a desire to kind of go, oh right, okay, let me just have a listen to this. And my dad, a little bit better at it. And one of the things I've always tried to do is, right, what are people listening to? What are people reading? What are people doing at the moment? And well, let's have a look at that. So I try and listen to new music a lot. I listen to new podcasts. If someone recommends a podcast, I'll always give it one episode because I want that thing of just remain curious, because I think it results in a more rounded person.
I love that. I think many of us will find value in staying curious, because you ask better questions, get better answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. Pete, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much, Steve. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, one final point, actually.
Yeah.
If people want to get in touch with you, they want to talk to you. I know you do podcast training. Is it podcast in a box? Is that?
We do podcast in a box, which is basically we kind of set you up with kind of a microphone and a pair of headphones and a bit of soundproofing, if that's what you need, and we kind of hold your hand through the opening process going up to the kind of the launch of your podcast. We have the podcast clinic where you can send us an episode of your podcast. We'll listen back to it and tell you how we think you can make it better. It's always constructive what we say. But yeah, I'm always happy to just chat podcasts as well.
Where's the best place for someone to find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. So if you just look for Pete Morgan, I think my LinkedIn address is LinkedIn / whatever word it is, and then / podcasts. So I got in that really early on.
And well,
there's the website, monkeypantsproductions.co.uk, or you could just always chuck us an email, pete@monkeypantsproductions.co.uk. And as I say, always happy to talk podcasts.
Wonderful. We'll put all them links in the show notes as well. So Pete, it's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Steve.